There are cases that make you lose faith in humanity, cases that crawl under your skin and stay there long after the news has faded. This one, what happened to a little girl named Eliana, might be one of the darkest. A case so gut-wrenching that even seasoned police officers said they'd never forget the sight of her tiny body, or the silence that filled the room when the truth came out. The story begins with a mother's promise, or what was supposed to be one. Every child enters the world with the same fragile hope that their parents will love them, protect them, and give them the chance to grow. But for 20-month-old Eliana Plummer, that promise was broken almost as soon as it was made. From the outside, everything looked ordinary. A young mother, a new apartment, a fresh start. Neighbors saw her smile at her daughter, bring her to church, call her my miracle. But inside that apartment, a nightmare was unfolding, one that no one stopped, even when they could have. Eliana's short life became a portrait of how a system, a community, and even a mother can all fail a child who can't speak for herself. Her story isn't just about violence, it's about silence. About every time someone looked away, every moment when someone thought, maybe it's not my place to intervene. This case forces us to ask the hardest question of all. How many warnings does it take before a tragedy becomes inevitable? Before we unravel the horror that followed, I want you to picture something simple. A toddler's laughter echoing through a small apartment. The smell of baby shampoo, a favorite stuffed animal lying on the couch. All the little details that say home. Now imagine that light fading slowly day by day until that same apartment became a chamber of neglect, fear, and pain. That's the story of Eliana. This is not just another true crime. It's a call to remember that every cry we ignore has consequences, and every warning unheeded writes another name in tragedy. Eliana Margie Plummer came into the world on March 25, 2021, in Louisville, Kentucky, her tiny hands wrapping around a future that was supposed to be bright. Her middle name honored her grandmother, a woman who never got to meet her, but whose memory carried hope for a gentler life. Those first months were filled with what every parent knows well: the late-night feedings, the first laugh, the chaos of toys underfoot, and the tender awe that comes from watching a child discover the world. But beneath that ordinary joy, cracks had already begun to form. Her mother, Cheyenne Hill, carried her own history of trauma. She had grown up in a house where chaos wasn't the exception, it was the rhythm. Violence, neglect, instability, these were not strangers to her. And though she vowed she'd never repeat what she'd endured, cycles like that rarely break on their own. When Eliana's father, Aaron Plummer, started working out of state, the family's fragile structure began to collapse. The distance turned into silence, and soon Cheyenne and Eliana were on their own. Cheyenne called it a fresh start, but in truth, it was an escape, a quiet attempt to outrun her own ghosts. She packed up and moved to Bedford, Indiana, into an apartment complex called Maple Ridge. It looked peaceful from the outside: clean lawns, friendly neighbors, the kind of place that felt safe. But the moment she met Cameron Fleming, that illusion shattered. He was older, polite, a man who seemed stable and even comforting at first. He worked in healthcare, carried himself with confidence, and to a single mother desperate for security, that must have felt like an anchor. But anchors can also drag you under. Cameron had a history of manipulation and volatility that Cheyenne either didn't see or didn't want to. He quickly became a controlling presence in her life, and by extension, in Eliana's. What neither of them could have imagined was that his ex-wife, Kara, lived just across the complex, and she would become one of the few people who dared to speak up. Kara noticed the small things first: bruises that didn't fade, swelling that didn't look accidental, a mother who seemed increasingly withdrawn. She began documenting what she saw, calling Child Protective Services again and again, hoping someone would step in before things spiraled further. But those calls, 4 in total, went unanswered in time. Each one was a warning bell ringing into the void. To outsiders, Cheyenne still looked like a mother doing her best, tired perhaps, but devoted. She told people her daughter had lupus when her hair began falling out, shaving the little girl's head to help. She said the bruises came from clumsiness, that toddlers fall, that things just happen. But behind that thin curtain of excuses was a reality no one wanted to face. A child's suffering becoming normalized, invisible, explained away. When neighbors asked if Eliana was okay, Cheyenne smiled and said, "She's fine, just a little sick." But Ellie, as they called her, wasn't fine. She was fading physically, emotionally, and slowly. What started as neglect was turning into cruelty. In the months that followed, the apartment at Maple Ridge became both a home and a prison for little Eliana. At first, the changes were subtle. The child who once giggled and reached for strangers now avoided eye contact. Her playful energy faded into silence. Neighbors began to notice bruises on her arms and cheeks, too frequent to be coincidence, too patterned to be explained away as falls. Kara Fleming, Cameron's ex-wife, was one of the first to raise alarms. She called Child Protective Services not once, but 4 separate times, describing injuries, the strange smells of chemicals from the apartment, the sounds of shouting, and a toddler who seemed to be wasting away. Each call was logged, each report filed, and then buried under bureaucracy. If you've ever wondered how many chances the system gets before it fails, this case gives a painful answer. 4. 4 times someone spoke for a child who couldn't, and 4 times the silence of inaction spoke louder. Eliana's babysitter, Michelle Barrow, also began noticing things that made her stomach turn. The little girl's hair was falling out. She was thinner, quieter, almost hollow-eyed. When Michelle suggested using a high chair to teach her to eat, Cheyenne refused, claiming her daughter preferred eating off the floor. She called it free roaming, as if feeding her child like a pet were a form of care. Michelle knew something was wrong, but she was trapped in that familiar dilemma, wanting to help, fearing she'd overstep. What if she was wrong? What if confronting the mother only made things worse? Those questions have haunted many people since. Then there were the other neighbors, Kevin and Kara, who lived directly below. They could hear muffled crying through the floor, followed by sharp thuds and Cheyenne's voice yelling. Kevin remembered the tone, not exasperated like a parent disciplining a toddler, but venomous, the kind of anger that doesn't belong near a child. "Shut up or I'll throw you into the wall," he once heard her scream. It was a line that would replay in his memory for years, because he later realized those might have been the last words that little girl ever heard. By October 2022, things had deteriorated so badly that even strangers noticed something was off. Cheyenne brought Eliana to a clinic when her hair loss became impossible to ignore. The doctors suggested autoimmune tests, possibly lupus, maybe malnutrition, but when the lab technician wasn't available that day, Cheyenne simply left. She never returned. The medical system, like the social one, had offered her an open door. She closed it herself. Every red flag was visible. Every warning had been made. But somehow, the people meant to protect Eliana, her mother, her community, the agencies failed her at every level. And this is the hardest truth about stories like this. Evil doesn't always hide. Sometimes it's reported, documented, and even confirmed, but still allowed to continue. November 2022 arrived like the calm before a storm, gray skies, cold mornings, and a quiet that hid something sinister. By then, 20-month-old Eliana was no longer the curious child neighbors once knew. She barely spoke, barely moved, and her small body bore the marks of months of suffering. The babysitter, Michelle, described her as half there, her movements slow and fragile. Kevin, who lived below, said he no longer heard laughter, only thuds, then silence. The warning calls to Child Protective Services had grown more desperate. Reports of bruises, swelling, and the smell of chemicals from the apartment. One caller even said, "That child looks half dead." Still, no one came. The night before Thanksgiving should have been filled with warmth and food and family. Instead, it became the last night of Eliana's life. Cheyenne claimed the toddler fell out of bed and hit her head, a story that would later collapse under medical scrutiny. The swelling was massive, grotesque even, but she refused to take her daughter to the hospital. She called Cameron Fleming instead, the man who had become her twisted partner in control. He told her to ice it, to wait. And she listened. That moment was the line between injury and death. Neighbors later said they heard crying that night. Kevin recalled the words that made his blood run cold. "Shut up, or I'll throw you into the wall." No one knocked on the door. No one called 911. In hindsight, everyone wished they had. But hindsight doesn't bring children back. In the early hours of November 23rd, Eliana's breathing grew shallow. Her skin turned pale. Her limbs stiffened. Instead of calling an ambulance, Cheyenne called Cameron again, spent nearly 40 minutes describing her daughter's condition while doing nothing to save her. Then, as if nothing was wrong, she smoked marijuana to calm herself, got dressed for work, and left the apartment. Her daughter was dying in the next room. When she returned a few hours later, the child was unresponsive. Panic finally struck, but it wasn't the kind born of love. It was the kind that comes when you realize the lie you've been telling is about to collapse. She carried Eliana to the car, drove her to the hospital, and handed her limp body to doctors who had seen many things, but nothing quite like this. They fought for hours to save her, but her injuries were catastrophic. Her skull was fractured, her brain was bleeding on both sides, and her small body was covered in bruises and burns in different stages of healing. She had broken bones that were never treated. She was starving. She had been tortured slowly, over time, by the one person who was supposed to protect her. When detectives interviewed Cheyenne that day, she sat emotionless. She said she didn't know her child was that hurt. She repeated her lies about a fall from the bed, about lupus, about bad luck. But the evidence told another story. The doctors said it plainly. This wasn't an accident. This was abuse repeated, deliberate, and fatal. When paramedics carried Eliana into the emergency room that morning, even the most experienced doctors stopped in disbelief. They had seen abuse before, but not like this. The child's body told a story no one wanted to read. Her skin was pale, her limbs rigid, her head grotesquely swollen from a massive brain bleed. Bruises covered every inch of her tiny frame, some fresh, some old, layered like pages in a book of suffering that had been written one blow at a time. Her collarbone was broken. There were burns on her cheeks that looked like they came from cigarettes. Her weight was 10 pounds below normal, her stomach distended from malnutrition. The nurses who tried to stabilize her would later testify that they couldn't stop shaking. One of them said, "It was like trying to save a child who had already been gone for days." Cheyenne's behavior in those first hours only deepened the horror. She cried, but not in the way a mother cries when her world collapses. It was performative, fragmented sobbing 1 minute, coldly detached the next. When a doctor explained how severe the injuries were, she didn't ask, "Will she live?" She asked, "How long will this take?" Later, she even left the hospital to go to work, buying sandwiches and coffee at Walmart while her daughter's heart fought to keep beating. Nurses described her as hollow, unaffected, almost robotic. When a representative from the Indiana donor network approached her about potential organ donation, because doctors already knew Eliana wouldn't survive, Cheyenne didn't hesitate to speak. But instead of showing compassion, she said something that made everyone in the room freeze. She compared her 20-month-old to Jeffrey Dahmer. She wasn't a nice kid, she said, as if explaining away a monster instead of mourning a daughter. Behind the hospital doors, Eliana's body was fighting a battle it could no longer win. The brain hemorrhage was catastrophic. The swelling had compressed her brainstem. She had been brain dead long before the ambulance ever arrived. At 4:35 p.m. on November 26, 2022, doctors pronounced her dead. The room fell silent. Even in death, she gave something back. Her organs saved 3 lives: a little boy, a young girl, and a man in his 40s. It's impossible not to feel both fury and heartbreak at that fact. How someone so small who suffered so much could still give more in death than her mother ever gave her in life. When investigators received the autopsy, the findings confirmed their worst fears. This was not one moment of anger, but months of torture. Lacerations inside the mouth, healed fractures, bruises in multiple stages of recovery, all signs of long-term abuse. The fatal injuries occurred within the last 72 hours, but her suffering had been accumulating for weeks. The coroner's words were chilling in their simplicity. This child died from repeated blunt force trauma to the head. The manner of death is homicide. When detectives sat Cheyenne Hill down in that small beige interrogation room, the air itself felt heavy. A table, 2 chairs, a recording light blinking red. She looked calm, almost composed, her voice soft and measured. To the officers watching through the glass, that calm was unnerving. It wasn't the kind born of innocence. It was the kind that comes when someone has spent too long rehearsing their story. Detective Jim Sloan began gently, asking her to walk them through the morning of November 23rd. She spoke with the tone of someone discussing an inconvenience, not the death of her child. She was fine, she said. She just fell off the bed. Babies fall. She explained that the swelling on her daughter's forehead had gone down after icing it, that she thought Eliana was only tired, that she didn't know it was a brain bleed. Every sentence was an attempt to minimize, to normalize what could never be normal. When asked why she didn't call 911, she shrugged. I thought she'd be okay. I didn't think it was that bad. But detectives had already seen the medical report. They knew the injury had occurred days earlier. They knew the child's skull fracture wasn't from one fall, it was from multiple impacts. They knew her body told a story of neglect and pain that no accident could explain. Still, they let Cheyenne talk. In her rambling narrative, she shifted blame to everyone else: Cameron, the babysitter, even the neighbors. Maybe they did something when I wasn't there, she said. Maybe they dropped her. When investigators pointed out inconsistencies, she snapped. You don't know what it's like to be a single mom. At one point, she broke into tears, but the timing was wrong. It came not when discussing her daughter's suffering, but when describing her own fear of being blamed. I didn't do it, she said between sobs. I loved her. I would have given my life for her. The words echoed in the room, hollow against the weight of evidence. Because love doesn't leave bruises. Love doesn't ignore a dying child for 40 minutes while lighting a joint and heading to work. What struck the detectives most was her emotional detachment. When they showed her photos of Eliana's injuries, she didn't flinch. When they asked about the swelling so severe, it made the child's face unrecognizable. She said flatly, she bruises easy. When pressed on the repeated CPS reports, she became defensive. They just didn't like me. People lie. Even when she was asked the most haunting question, why didn't you just take her to the hospital? She could only offer a shrug and a quiet, I don't know. To watch that footage is to feel an ache that words can't contain. It wasn't just guilt or denial, it was the absence of empathy itself. In that small room, surrounded by evidence of her own daughter's torment, Cheyenne Hill revealed what had been missing from the start: humanity. As the interrogation went on, Cheyenne's stories began to contradict themselves like threads pulling loose from a badly stitched fabric. Every time detectives cornered her with evidence, she shifted the narrative, again changing details, inventing new villains, anything to deflect responsibility. One moment, she said the injury happened when her daughter rolled off the bed. The next, she blamed the babysitter, claiming she must have dropped her. Later, she suggested that Cameron Fleming, her boyfriend, might have done it without realizing, conveniently forgetting that he had been the one advising her not to seek medical help. It was as if she thought the truth could be buried under a mountain of excuses. But the detectives weren't just listening. They were studying her. They noticed how she spoke faster when lying, how her tone shifted from defensive to victimized when challenged. It was a performance without conviction, and the script kept changing. The footage from that day is one of the most unsettling pieces of evidence in the case. When Cheyenne was shown photos of Eliana's face, marked with finger-shaped bruises, she didn't recoil in horror. She analyzed them. She asked, "Could you tell what size the person's hand was?" As if discussing something academic, not the beating of her own child. When told those prints likely came from someone gripping the toddler's face, her only reaction was to speculate whose hand fit. She suggested Cameron's, then Kevin's, then circled back to maybe it was the fall. Her words were a carousel of denial, spinning so fast it made even the detectives queasy. And yet, amidst the chaos of her deflections, one thing remained constant: the absence of remorse. Even when the conversation turned to the hours before Eliana's death, those final moments when she was slipping away, Cheyenne insisted she did everything right. "She was just sleeping," she said. "How was I supposed to know?" The detective leaned forward, voice heavy but calm. "Because any mother would know." The silence that followed said more than she ever could. Her lies extended beyond the interrogation room. To friends, she painted herself as the victim of a witch hunt. To hospital staff, she claimed ignorance. But the evidence was relentless. Medical examiners confirmed that the child's injuries had been inflicted over time, fractures in different stages of healing, malnutrition so severe her growth had been stunted, internal bleeding that could only have come from repeated blows. This wasn't one mistake. It was a pattern of cruelty disguised as care. When confronted with these findings, Cheyenne tried to twist her narrative once more. "I didn't know she was hurt that bad," she whispered, eyes glassy but dry. But what she didn't realize was that her every word was now reinforcing the case against her. The more she spoke, the clearer it became. She wasn't just negligent. She was lying to preserve the only thing she still cared about: herself. When the trial began in February 2024, the courtroom felt less like a place of justice and more like a wound being reopened in public. Reporters filled the benches. Parents clutched their children tighter. Even the officers who had worked the case sat with quiet dread, knowing what the evidence would show. Cheyenne Hill entered wearing a pale orange jumpsuit, her face as unreadable as ever. No tears, no trembling hands, just that same blank expression that had haunted everyone since the day her daughter died. The charge: neglect resulting in death, a phrase that sounded too clinical for the horror it described. The prosecution opened with the words no one would forget. This was not a mistake. This was a mother who chose silence over mercy. From that moment, the case unfolded with devastating clarity. Doctors, neighbors, and social workers all took the stand. Each testimony added another piece to a puzzle everyone wished didn't exist. Michelle, the babysitter, cried through most of her statement as she recalled how she had tried to help, how she'd seen bruises and begged Cheyenne to take Eliana to the doctor. "She told me she'd handle it," Michelle said softly. But she didn't. Then came Kevin, the neighbor whose voice cracked as he described the night he heard the shouting. She said, "Shut up or I'll throw you into the wall." And then it stopped. His words hung in the air like smoke. Medical experts followed. Their testimony was clinical but unbearable. They described the bruises, the burns, the skull fracture, the internal bleeding. They explained that Eliana's head injury alone would have caused her immense pain and required immediate treatment. Instead, she was left to die. One doctor paused mid-sentence, visibly shaken, before whispering, "We failed her." Everyone did. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of muffled sobs. The defense tried to reframe the story as an accident. They painted Cheyenne as overwhelmed, a single mother who made poor decisions but didn't mean harm. They claimed she trusted the wrong people, that she'd been manipulated by Cameron Fleming. But the jury had seen the text messages where she dismissed the child's injuries, where she lied to friends about lupus, where she refused to call for help. They saw the video of her interrogation, the lack of emotion, the shifting stories. The narrative of overwhelmed mother couldn't survive the mountain of evidence that showed deliberate neglect and cold indifference. When the prosecutors displayed a photo of Eliana smiling, bright-eyed, before everything changed, the courtroom broke. Even the judge looked down, his voice catching as he reminded the jury to remain composed. Because sometimes justice requires you to look directly at the unbearable dot. It took only 2 hours for the jury to reach a verdict. Guilty. Cheyenne didn't cry. She didn't look up. She simply sat there, motionless, as if she had already left her body long ago. But for everyone else in that room, for the nurses, the neighbors, the father, it was both a relief and a heartbreak. Justice had come, but far too late to matter. On April 23, 2024, the courtroom was full again, though the mood this time was heavier, quieter, more resolved. The trial had ended, but this day, the sentencing was about something deeper than guilt. It was about acknowledgement, about forcing the woman who had taken a life to finally face the enormity of what she'd done. Cheyenne Hill sat in her seat, her orange jumpsuit pressed and her hair neatly tied back, as if this were just another appointment to endure. She didn't look at the gallery where Eliana's family sat. She didn't look at the judge. And she didn't look at the empty chair where her daughter should have been. Judge John Plummer's voice was calm but deliberate as he read the statement that would seal her fate. This little girl needed someone to speak for her, to protect her, to advocate for her. It was your responsibility to do that, and you did not. Instead, you failed her in every way a mother can fail a child. His words cut through the silence like a blade. 30 years. That was the sentence. 30 years for a crime that had stolen an entire lifetime. For many, it felt like too little. For others, it was at least something, a mark of accountability in a case where the system itself had already failed. As the sentence was read, Cheyenne didn't flinch. No tears, no plea, no whisper of apology. The judge looked directly at her and said, "You have shown no remorse." And she didn't dispute it. Then came Eliana's father. Aaron Plummer stood at the podium, his hands shaking, his voice breaking as he spoke through tears that had waited far too long to fall. "I will never get to see her smile again," he said. "I will never hear her call me daddy. I'll never watch her go to school or fall in love or grow old. I will never have another chance to protect her." The room was silent, except for the sound of his grief echoing through it. In that moment, it was clear that justice, no matter how firm, could never balance what had been lost. The press later reported that Cheyenne showed no visible reaction to her sentence. But that's what everyone already expected. Because how do you express remorse for something you never allowed yourself to feel? What haunted people most wasn't her indifference in court. It was that there had been so many chances before this day to save Eliana. 4 CPS reports. A babysitter's pleas. A neighbor's warning. Each one ignored. Each one lost in the shuffle. And that's what truly kept people awake at night. The knowledge that the system designed to protect her had been just as silent as the woman who destroyed her. Outside the courthouse, a small group gathered to release white balloons in Eliana's memory. They rose slowly into the sky, catching the sunlight, fading one by one until the last balloon disappeared. For a moment, the crowd stood still, staring upward as if watching her spirit drift somewhere beyond their reach. Because that's what justice often feels like, something symbolic, fragile, weightless against the gravity of loss. When the headlines faded and the courtroom emptied, all that remained was the quiet ache of what could have been. Eliana Margie Plummer would have turned 4 this year. She might have been learning to count, tracing letters on a kitchen table, asking endless questions the way curious toddlers do. Her laughter might have filled the same apartment where silence once reigned. But instead, her story became another entry in the growing list of children failed not just by cruelty, but by indifference. The people who should have saved her didn't, the mother who ignored her cries, the agencies that dismissed reports, the neighbors who hesitated. And that's what makes her story unbearable. She was not invisible. She was seen, and still, no one acted in time. It's easy to point to monsters and think they're rare, but the truth is more chilling. The real danger often hides in plain sight in tired explanations, in excuses that sound reasonable, in the voice that says, "It's not my place." Every ignored red flag is a choice. Every call that doesn't get made, every report that sits unopened, is another brick in the wall that trapped Eliana. When we say never again, it has to mean something more than outrage. It has to mean intervention. There's a painful irony in her story. Even in death, she gave more than she ever received in life. Her heart, her liver, her kidneys, they saved 3 people. That's not just tragedy. That's grace. A tiny child who never got love managed to give it anyway, in the most literal way possible. Maybe that's her legacy, a reminder that even in the face of horror, goodness can still ripple outward. But that ripple only matters if we let it change us. Every person who hears this story now carries a piece of responsibility. The next time you suspect a child is being hurt, don't wait. Don't rationalize. Don't hope someone else will handle it. Call, report, intervene. Because silence doesn't protect. The innocent protects the guilty. And for Eliana, silence was a weapon more deadly than any hand that struck her. Some say justice was served. But justice would have been her living past 20 months. Her giggling in a classroom, her dancing barefoot in the grass. What we have instead is a caution carved in heartbreak, a reminder that love, at its simplest, is vigilance. The only way to honor her is to make sure her name stands for change, not just sorrow. So tonight, wherever you are, if you see a child laughing, playing, asking questions, remember Eliana. Remember that her story is more than tragedy. It's a test of empathy. Because when a society forgets to listen to its smallest voices, it loses something of its soul. The story of Eliana Plummer is not just about one child's suffering. It's about a collective failure that must never repeat. Evil thrives in silence, and indifference kills as surely as violence. Her short life reminds us that the smallest act of intervention, the simplest phone call, can be the difference between survival and tragedy. We cannot change what happened to Eliana, but we can honor her by refusing to look away again.